The quiet giant. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds of Camp Pendleton as Sergeant Major Marcus Tank Rodriguez walked slowly toward the recruit barracks. At 52 years old, his weathered face told stories of 3 decades in the Marines, but his steady gait and broad shoulders still commanded respect. The recruits didn't know it yet, but they were about to meet a living legend. Tank had earned his nickname not from his size, though he stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, but from his ability to keep moving forward no matter what stood in his way. He had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and countless classified operations that would never make it into any official record. His chest bore rows of ribbons that most Marines could only dream of earning, including the Silver Star, Bronze Star with Combat V, and Purple Heart with 3 oak leaf clusters. But Tank wasn't at Camp Pendleton to show off his decorations. He was there because the Marine Corps had a problem. A group of new recruits had been causing trouble, challenging authority, and making life miserable for their drill instructors. These weren't just typical rebellious teenagers learning discipline. These young men came from privileged backgrounds, had connections in high places, and seemed to believe that rules didn't apply to them. The group's ringleader was 20-year-old Bradley Hartwell III, whose father was a powerful senator with influence over military funding. Bradley had been kicked out of 2 elite private colleges for various incidents involving violence and intimidation. Rather than face criminal charges, his family had arranged for him to be enlisted in the Marines, thinking that military service would either straighten him out or at least keep him out of the headlines for a while. Bradley had quickly gathered around him a core group of like-minded recruits. There was Kevin Morrison, whose uncle was a federal judge and whose family owned a chain of successful restaurants across the East Coast. Then came Tyler Chen, the son of a tech billionaire who had made his fortune in Silicon Valley. The 4th member of their little gang was Marcus Williams, whose mother was a famous defense attorney known for getting wealthy clients out of serious legal troubles. These 4 had turned their barracks into their personal kingdom. They bullied weaker recruits, stole food and personal items, and openly mocked their drill instructors. When anyone tried to discipline them, mysterious phone calls would be made, and suddenly the punishment would disappear. The other recruits lived in fear, afraid to speak up because they knew these young men had the power to destroy their military careers before they even began. Tank had been called in specifically to deal with this situation. The base commander, Colonel Sarah Mitchell, had worked with Tank for over 15 years and knew that if anyone could handle these troublemakers, it was him. She had tried everything else: different drill instructors, separate training groups, even individual counseling sessions. Nothing worked because these recruits knew they were untouchable. "Tank," Colonel Mitchell had said during their private meeting, "I need someone who won't be intimidated by their family connections. Someone who's been through enough that a few phone calls from angry parents won't make him back down. These boys are destroying unit cohesion and making it impossible to train the other recruits properly." Tank had simply nodded. He had seen entitled young men before, though usually not in the military. The Marines had a way of humbling people quickly, but these particular recruits had found a way to game the system. Their family's influence had created a shield around them that traditional military discipline couldn't penetrate. As Tank approached the barracks that first morning, he could hear loud voices and laughter coming from inside. Through the windows, he could see Bradley and his friends playing cards while other recruits were supposed to be cleaning their equipment. The scene was a perfect example of the breakdown in discipline that had been reported. Tank paused outside the door, listening to the conversation inside. Bradley was telling a story about how his father had gotten him out of trouble at his last college. "The dean thought he could expel me just because I put that nerd in the hospital," Bradley was saying with obvious pride. "But one phone call from my dad, and suddenly it was all a big misunderstanding. The kid even apologized to me for falling down the stairs." The other 3 laughed, and Tyler added his own story about bribing campus security to look the other way while he sold drugs to other students. "The best part," Tyler said, is that my dad's lawyers made sure it never appeared on any official records. As far as anyone knows, I'm a model citizen." Tank had heard enough. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention. The card game stopped, and the four troublemakers looked up with expressions that ranged from curiosity to mild annoyance. The other recruits in the barracks quickly stood at attention, recognizing the rank insignia on Tank's uniform. "Gentlemen," Tank said quietly, his voice carrying easily across the room despite its low volume. "I'm Sergeant Major Rodriguez. I'll be working with your unit for the next few weeks." Bradley looked Tank up and down with obvious disrespect. "Great! Another drill instructor who thinks he can scare us. Look, Sergeant Major, I don't know what they told you about us, but we're not like the other recruits here. Our families have serious connections, and we're not going to be pushed around by some—" Tank raised one hand, and Bradley's voice died instantly. There was something in the older Marine's eyes that suggested interrupting him would be a very bad idea. The entire barracks fell silent. "Mr. Hartwell," Tank said, somehow knowing Bradley's name without being introduced. "I've read your file. I've read all of your files. I know exactly who your families are, what they've done for you in the past, and what they think they can do for you now." He walked slowly around the room, his boots making soft sounds on the polished floor. The other recruits remained frozen at attention, while Bradley and his friends tried to project an air of casual defiance. "What your families don't understand," Tank continued, "is that they've sent you to a place where their influence ends at the front gate. In here, there are only two things that matter: what you can do and how much pain you can endure while learning to do it better." Kevin Morrison spoke up, his voice shaky but trying to sound tough. "Look, my uncle is a federal judge. If you think you can treat us like common soldiers, you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble." Tank turned to face Kevin directly, and the young man immediately regretted speaking. Tank's expression hadn't changed, but something in his posture suggested that he was a predator evaluating prey. "Mr. Morrison," Tank said calmly, "your uncle's authority extends over federal courtrooms. Mine extends over this training ground. Would you like to test which one of us has more power in this particular location?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Bradley, sensing that his leadership was being questioned, stood up from where he had been sitting on his bunk. "You can't threaten us," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had held moments earlier. "We know our rights." Tank smiled for the first time since entering the barracks, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Rights," he said softly. "Son, you signed away most of your rights the day you took the oath. But don't worry about what you've lost. Focus on what you might still earn." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The other recruits sensed that something significant was happening, though they couldn't yet understand what. Bradley and his friends were beginning to realize that Tank was different from the other authority figures they had encountered. He wasn't angry or frustrated. He wasn't trying to intimidate them with shouting or threats. He was simply stating facts with the confidence of someone who had never lost a battle that truly mattered. "Now," Tank said, his voice returning to a conversational tone, "I understand that you gentlemen have been having some difficulties adjusting to military life. That's perfectly normal. Many recruits struggle with the transition from civilian comfort to military discipline. The difference is that most recruits want to overcome those difficulties. They want to earn the title of Marine." He paused, looking directly at each of the four troublemakers in turn. "The question I have for you is simple. Do you want to earn that title? Or are you here because someone else decided this was the best way to keep you out of prison?" The silence stretched on for nearly a minute. Finally, Bradley found his voice again. "We're here because we choose to be here," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. Tank nodded slowly. "Then tomorrow morning, we'll begin finding out what that choice really means. Formation is at 0500 hours. That's 5 o'clock in the morning for those of you who might not be familiar with military time. We'll start with a light run, just 5 miles to get the blood flowing. Tyler laughed nervously. 5 miles? Are you crazy? We're not marathon runners. Tank's expression didn't change. Mr. Chen, 5 miles is what we call a warm-up. If you think that's challenging, you're going to find the next few weeks very educational. He turned toward the door, then paused and looked back. Oh, and gentlemen, the days of special treatment end now. From this moment forward, you'll be held to the same standards as every other Marine recruit. No phone calls from family will change that. No legal threats will modify it. No amount of money will buy you an exemption. As Tank walked toward the exit, Bradley called after him. What makes you think you're so special? You're just another jarhead with an attitude problem. Tank stopped without turning around. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that everyone in the barracks had to strain to hear him. Mr. Hartwell, by the time I'm finished with your training, you'll understand exactly what makes me special. And if you're very lucky, you might even learn to become special yourself. With that, he walked out, leaving behind a group of young men who were beginning to realize that their old life of privilege and immunity had just come to an end. They had no idea yet what they had gotten themselves into, but they were about to learn that some battles couldn't be won with family connections or legal threats. The reckoning begins. The next morning arrived like a slap in the face. At exactly 5 o'clock, Tank stood outside the barracks with a calm expression, while the other recruits stumbled out in various states of readiness. Bradley and his crew were notably absent until Tank sent another recruit to physically drag them from their bunks. When they finally appeared, they were disheveled, angry, and clearly unprepared for what was about to happen. "Gentlemen," Tank announced to the assembled group, "today we begin your real education. You've been playing at being Marines for weeks now. Today, you learn what that title actually requires." The 5-mile run started at a pace that seemed manageable to most recruits, but Tank gradually increased the speed until the weaker members of the group were struggling to keep up. Bradley and his friends, who had spent months avoiding physical training, were gasping for air within the first mile. By mile 3, Kevin was vomiting on the side of the trail, and Tyler was openly cursing Tank with every breath he could spare, but Tank wasn't finished. When they returned to base, he immediately ordered the entire group into the obstacle course. This wasn't the sanitized version that most drill instructors used for beginners. This was the advanced course designed for Marines preparing for combat deployment. Rope climbs, wall scaling, crawling through mud under barbed wire, and a series of physical challenges that pushed even the fittest recruits to their limits. Bradley made it halfway through the first obstacle before his strength gave out completely. He hung from a rope 30 feet off the ground, his arms shaking with exhaustion. "I can't do this," he called down to Tank. "This is insane. I want to call my father." Tank looked up at him with patient eyes. "Mr. Hartwell, your father isn't going to climb that rope for you. Your family's money can't reach up there and pull you over that wall. Right now, there's only you, that rope, and the choice of whether you're going to quit or find out what you're actually capable of." "You don't understand," Bradley shouted, his voice cracking with panic and exhaustion. "My family doesn't accept failure. If I can't do this, they'll make sure you pay for it." Tank's response was barely audible from ground level, but every recruit heard it clearly. "Son, your family has already failed you worse than any drill instructor ever could. They've convinced you that you're helpless without their protection. Today, you get the chance to prove them wrong." The psychological impact of Tank's words hit Bradley harder than any physical challenge could have. For the first time in his life, someone had suggested that his family's influence might actually be a weakness rather than a strength. The idea was so foreign to his worldview that he lost his grip on the rope and fell 15 feet into the safety net below. Marcus Williams, watching his friend's humiliation, decided to take a different approach. Instead of trying to complete the obstacles, he began deliberately sabotaging them. When other recruits tried to cross a balance beam, Marcus would shake it. When someone was climbing the rope wall, he would step on the bottom of the rope to make it harder to climb. Tank observed this behavior for exactly 3 minutes before taking action. He walked over to Marcus with the same calm demeanor he had maintained all morning, but there was something different in his eyes now. The other recruits sensed it immediately and gave them a wide berth. "Mr. Williams," Tank said quietly, "it seems you've decided that if you can't succeed, you'll prevent others from succeeding. Is that an accurate assessment of your strategy?" Marcus, still believing that his attitude made him look tough, smirked. "Maybe I just don't see the point in pretending this military garbage matters. We all know I'll be out of here in a few months anyway." Tank nodded thoughtfully. "You might be right about leaving, but you won't be leaving the same person who arrived. Every man who goes through Marine training is changed by it. The only question is whether that change makes you stronger or breaks you completely." "What's that supposed to mean?" Marcus asked, though his smirk was starting to fade. Instead of answering, Tank turned to address the entire group. "Everyone gather around. Mr. Williams has just volunteered to demonstrate an important principle of Marine Corps training. The principle is simple. When one Marine fails, the entire unit suffers the consequences." Marcus looked confused, but the other recruits were beginning to understand what was happening. Tank had them all assume the push-up position while Marcus remained standing. "Mr. Williams," Tank explained, "your fellow recruits are now going to do push-ups until you successfully complete the obstacle course that you've been sabotaging. They'll stay in that position, holding their own body weight, while you figure out whether your selfishness is worth their pain." Marcus looked around at the other recruits, who were already straining to maintain their positions. Several of them were looking at him with expressions that made it clear what they thought of his behavior. For the first time since arriving at Camp Pendleton, Marcus was seeing real consequences for his actions, consequences that affected people other than himself. "This is stupid," Marcus protested. "I didn't ask them to do push-ups." Tank's voice remained level. "No, but you chose to prevent them from completing their training. In the Marines, individual actions have group consequences. That's how we build units that can trust each other in combat situations." Tyler Chen, watching from the sidelines, made the mistake of laughing at Marcus's predicament. "Looks like Williams finally found something his mommy's law firm can't fix," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Tank turned his attention to Tyler with the swiftness of a striking snake. "Mr. Chen, since you find this situation amusing, perhaps you'd like to join Mr. Williams. The two of you can work together to complete the obstacle course while your fellow recruits maintain their positions." Tyler's laughter died instantly. "That's not fair. I wasn't the one sabotaging anything." "Mr. Chen," Tank replied, "you were the one who chose to mock a fellow recruit's struggle instead of encouraging him to do better. In the Marines, we build each other up, or we fail together." What happened next would be talked about in the barracks for months afterward. Tyler and Marcus, both exhausted and demoralized, attempted to help each other through the obstacle course, while their fellow recruits held push-up positions that became more painful with each passing minute. But instead of working together, the two began blaming each other for their situation. Marcus accused Tyler of being too weak to keep up. Tyler blamed Marcus for getting them both in trouble in the first place. Their argument escalated until they were shoving each other at the base of a 20-foot rope climb, while other recruits trembled with the effort of maintaining their positions. Tank watched this display with the patience of someone who had seen similar breakdowns many times before. He knew that this moment would define not just Tyler and Marcus, but the entire group of recruits. They were learning that their old survival strategies of manipulation, blame, and entitlement wouldn't work in this environment. Bradley, still nursing bruises from his fall, tried one more appeal to authority. "Sergeant Major, I demand to speak to your commanding officer. This treatment is unacceptable and my father will not tolerate it." Tank looked at Bradley with something that might have been pity. "Mr. Hartwell, your commanding officer is currently watching from the observation tower." He pointed to a structure overlooking the training ground where Colonel Mitchell stood with binoculars. "She's the one who specifically requested that I work with your group. She's also the one who has final authority over whether you complete this training or get transferred to a disciplinary unit." Bradley's face went pale. A disciplinary unit meant no special treatment, no family visits, and a record that would follow him for the rest of his military service. "But you can't just ignore our rights," he said weakly. Tank smiled that same unsettling smile he had used in the barracks. "Mr. Hartwell, you have the right to quit any time you want. You have the right to request a transfer. You have the right to file complaints through proper channels. What you don't have is the right to special treatment or the right to avoid consequences for your choices." The morning's training session lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, all 4 troublemakers had experienced complete physical and emotional exhaustion. They had learned that their old tactics of intimidation and manipulation not only failed to work on Tank, but actually made their situation worse. They had also learned that their behavior affected not just themselves, but every recruit in their unit. As the group staggered back to the barracks, Tank called Bradley aside for a private conversation. The young man approached with obvious reluctance, his earlier bravado completely gone. "Mr. Hartwell," Tank said quietly, "I want you to understand something important. I'm not your enemy. I'm not here to punish you or to prove that I'm tougher than you are. I'm here to give you an opportunity that your family's money can't buy." Bradley looked confused and exhausted. "What kind of opportunity?" Tank gestured toward the obstacle course they had just completed. "The opportunity to discover who you really are when all the external support is stripped away. The opportunity to find out if there's something inside you worth building on." "And if there isn't?" Bradley asked. Tank's expression became serious. "Then you'll wash out of training, just like 30% of all recruits do. But at least you'll know for certain what you're capable of, instead of spending the rest of your life wondering what might have been possible." That evening, Bradley and his friends huddled in their corner of the barracks, discussing their options. For the first time since arriving at Camp Pendleton, they were talking about the possibility that they might not make it through training. The invincibility that their family connections had always provided felt very far away. Kevin was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "Maybe we should call our families. Get transferred out before this gets worse." Tyler nodded eagerly. "My dad could have me out of here by tomorrow morning. This whole thing was a mistake anyway." Marcus was less certain. "But what happens then? We go back to what? More college parties? More getting bailed out every time we screw up?" Bradley, who had been silent through most of the conversation, finally spoke up. "I think that's exactly what he wants us to do. Tank. He wants us to quit so he can prove we're just spoiled rich kids who can't handle real challenges." "So, what are you saying?" Kevin asked. Bradley looked around at his friends, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. They were all exhausted, demoralized, and scared. But for the first time in months, they were also talking honestly about their situation instead of bragging about their latest schemes or their family's influence. "I'm saying maybe we should find out what happens if we don't quit," Bradley said quietly. "Maybe we should see what Tank thinks we're capable of before we decide he's wrong." The decision would change everything, though none of them realized it yet. They were about to discover that Tank had been testing them from the moment he walked into their barracks, and the real training was just beginning. The making of Marines. 3 weeks later, the transformation was undeniable. The 4 young men who had once terrorized their fellow recruits were now working alongside them, though the change hadn't come easily or without cost. Tank had systematically broken down every defense mechanism they had developed over years of privilege and entitlement, forcing them to confront the reality of who they had become and who they might choose to be. The breakthrough came during what Tank called the long night. It was a 24-hour field exercise designed to simulate the exhaustion and stress of actual combat conditions. The recruits had to work in teams to navigate through difficult terrain, solve tactical problems, and support each other through challenges that would have been impossible to complete individually. Bradley found himself paired with Ramon Gutierrez, a quiet recruit from East Los Angeles whose family had scraped together every dollar they had to help him join the Marines. Ramon had been one of the recruits that Bradley's group had bullied most severely during their early weeks at Camp Pendleton. Now, lost in the darkness of the California hills with only a map and compass, they were forced to depend on each other for survival. "I don't know why Tank paired us together," Bradley said during their third hour of hiking through rough terrain. His feet were covered in blisters, and his expensive hiking boots had proven completely inadequate for the rocky ground. Ramon, who was navigating using skills he had learned as a Boy Scout, looked back at his partner. "Maybe because he knew we both needed to learn something we couldn't figure out on our own." "Like what?" Bradley asked, genuinely curious despite his exhaustion. Ramon stopped walking and turned to face Bradley directly. "Like how to trust someone who has every reason not to trust you back." The conversation that followed changed both of their lives. Ramon told Bradley about growing up in a neighborhood where gangs controlled the streets and good kids had to fight every day just to make it to school safely. He talked about watching his father work 3 jobs to support the family and about the pride his parents felt when he enlisted in the Marines. Bradley, for the first time in his life, found himself listening to someone whose struggles made his own problems seem insignificant. He began to understand that the respect Ramon showed for the Marine Corps wasn't based on fear or obligation, but on genuine appreciation for an opportunity to serve something larger than himself. "I spent my whole life thinking I deserved respect because of who my family was," Bradley admitted as they reached the top of a ridge overlooking their destination. "But you earn respect every single day just by being who you are." Ramon nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to say that respect is like water. You can't hold on to it if your hands aren't clean." Meanwhile, Tyler and Marcus were having their own revelations during a survival exercise that required them to work with 2 other recruits to build shelter and start a fire using only basic tools. Their partners were Sarah Kim, a former college athlete who had joined the Marines to pay for medical school, and David Thompson, whose father had been killed in Iraq and who wore his dad's dog tags alongside his own. Marcus, who had always used sarcasm and cynicism as shields against genuine emotion, found himself moved by David's quiet dedication to honoring his father's memory. When Marcus complained about the difficulty of starting a fire with wet wood, David simply said, "My dad would have done it, so I'll figure out how to do it too." Tyler, watching David's patient persistence, began to understand the difference between real strength and the artificial confidence that money could buy. "You know," Tyler said quietly as they finally got their fire started, "I've never had to work for anything that really mattered." Sarah looked at him with surprise. It was the first honest thing she had heard Tyler say since training began. "So what matters now?" she asked. Tyler looked around at their small group. Huddled around the fire they had built together in the middle of nowhere. For the first time in his life, he was part of something that his family's money couldn't buy or improve. "This matters," he said simply. "Being able to count on people and having them count on me." Kevin's transformation came through a different route. During a medical training exercise, he was partnered with Jennifer Lopez, a former Army medic who was training to become a Marine officer. When Kevin initially made jokes about having to learn first aid, Jennifer's response was swift and uncompromising. "Chen," she said, using the last name they all went by during training, "someday you might be the only thing standing between a fellow Marine and death. Do you really think that's something to joke about?" The exercise required Kevin to treat simulated wounds using realistic medical training aids. For someone who had never seen real blood or serious injury, the experience was deeply unsettling. But Jennifer guided him through each step with the same patience and professionalism that she showed everyone else. "I don't think I can do this," Kevin admitted when faced with a particularly realistic trauma simulation. "What if I mess up? What if someone dies because I don't know what I'm doing?" Jennifer looked at him seriously. "Then you'd better learn to do it right, because that person is counting on you to figure it out." By the end of the exercise, Kevin had successfully completed every medical procedure in the training manual. More importantly, he had discovered that he was capable of staying calm and focused under pressure when lives were at stake. The responsibility was terrifying, but it was also the first time he had ever felt truly necessary, rather than simply entitled, to be there. Tank observed all of these changes with the satisfaction of someone who had seen similar transformations many times before. He knew that the real test would come when the four former troublemakers had to face a situation that challenged everything they had learned about themselves and each other. That test came during the final week of training, in the form of a crisis that no one had anticipated. During a routine training exercise, Ramon Gutierrez suffered a serious injury when a piece of equipment malfunctioned and sent him tumbling down a steep embankment. He was unconscious and bleeding heavily, far from any immediate medical help. Bradley was the first to reach him, followed closely by Tank and several other recruits. Tank quickly assessed the situation and began barking orders. "Williams, get on the radio and call for medical evacuation. Chen, I need you to help me stop this bleeding. Morrison, establish a perimeter and make sure no other recruits get hurt trying to help." But instead of following Tank's orders, Bradley stepped forward. "Sergeant Major, I've been watching how you handle emergencies. Ramon's my partner, and I want to help treat his injuries." Tank looked at Bradley for a moment, evaluating his readiness. Then he nodded. "Chen, take the radio. Williams, Morrison, you're on perimeter duty. Hartwell, you're with me." What followed was 30 minutes of intensive medical care under the most stressful conditions imaginable. Bradley followed Tank's instructions precisely, helping to stabilize Ramon's injuries and keep him conscious until the helicopter arrived. When Ramon briefly regained consciousness, the first thing he saw was Bradley's face looking down at him with genuine concern. "Hang in there, partner," Bradley said quietly. "We're getting you out of here." Ramon managed a weak smile. "Thanks for not leaving me behind." Bradley's response surprised everyone who heard it, including himself. Marines don't leave Marines behind. Tank taught us that. After Ramon was evacuated to the base hospital, Tank gathered the entire training group for a debriefing session. The four young men who had once been the unit's biggest problem were now standing with the other recruits as equals, their earlier arrogance and entitlement completely gone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tank said, looking around at the assembled group, "today you acted like Marines. Not because you followed orders perfectly, and not because nothing went wrong. You acted like Marines because when one of your own was in danger, you put his welfare ahead of your own comfort and safety." He turned to look directly at Bradley, Tyler, Marcus, and Kevin. "Mr. Hartwell, 3 weeks ago you told me that your family connections made you untouchable. Today, you risked your own safety to save a fellow Marine who had every reason to hate you. Mr. Chen, you went from making jokes about medical training to potentially saving someone's life. Mr. Williams, you stopped looking for ways to avoid responsibility and started looking for ways to take on more of it. Mr. Morrison, you learned that real strength comes from supporting others, not from tearing them down." Bradley spoke up, his voice steady and clear. "Sergeant Major, we all wanted to thank you for not giving up on us. We know we didn't deserve the chance you gave us." Tank's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Hartwell, every Marine deserves the chance to discover what they're capable of. My job was simply to make sure you couldn't hide from that discovery." "What happens now?" Tyler asked. Do we get to graduate with everyone else? Tank smiled, and for the first time since they had met him, it was a genuinely warm expression. Mr. Chen, you'll graduate when you've earned it just like every other Marine. But based on what I've seen over the past few weeks, I believe you will earn it. Marcus stepped forward. Sergeant Major, can I ask you something personal? Tank nodded. Why didn't you just recommend that we be kicked out? It would have been easier for everyone. Tank was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Mr. Williams, I've been a Marine for 30 years. In that time, I've learned that some of the best Marines are the ones who had to work the hardest to become worthy of the title. You four had further to travel than most, but that just means you had more opportunity to grow. Kevin raised his hand tentatively. What about our families? They're not going to understand the changes we've been through. Tank's expression became serious again. Mr. Morrison, your families raised you to believe that you were special because of what they could give you. Now you know that you're special because of what you can give others. Whether they understand that or not is their choice, but it doesn't change who you've chosen to become. The graduation ceremony took place 2 weeks later on a bright California morning. Bradley, Tyler, Marcus, and Kevin stood in formation with their fellow Marines, wearing their dress blue uniforms for the first time. Their families had flown in for the ceremony, expecting to see the same young men they had sent to Camp Pendleton months earlier. What they found instead were 4 confident, disciplined Marines who stood straight, spoke clearly, and showed genuine respect for their fellow service members. The change was so dramatic that several family members didn't initially recognize their own sons. During the reception following the ceremony, Bradley's father approached Tank with obvious confusion. Sergeant Major, I have to ask what you did to my son. He seems like a completely different person. Tank looked over at Bradley, who was deep in conversation with Ramon and several other Marines from his training unit. They were planning to stay in touch and support each other throughout their military careers. Senator Hartwell, I didn't change your son. I just gave him the opportunity to discover who he really was underneath all the protection your family provided. And who is he? Senator Hartwell asked. Tank smiled that warm smile again. He's a United States Marine, sir. And that's something he earned entirely on his own. The 4 young men who had once terrorized their fellow recruits went on to distinguished military careers. Bradley became an officer and led Marines in combat operations overseas. Tyler used his intelligence and resourcefulness to become a military intelligence specialist. Marcus discovered a talent for logistics and helped coordinate supply operations for combat units. Kevin pursued his interest in medical training and became a Navy corpsman attached to a Marine unit. But perhaps most importantly, they never forgot the lesson that Tank had taught them during those difficult weeks at Camp Pendleton. They learned that real strength comes not from what others can do for you, but from what you can do for others. They learned that respect is earned through action, not inherited through birthright. And they learned that the most important battles are often fought not against external enemies, but against the limitations we place on ourselves. Years later, when each of them had become leaders in their own right, they would tell younger Marines about Sergeant Major Marcus Tank Rodriguez and the lessons he had taught them about what it truly means to earn the title of Marine. They would explain that Tank hadn't threatened them or broken them down through cruelty or intimidation. Instead, he had shown them a mirror that reflected not who they had been, but who they had the potential to become. And in the end, that made all the difference.